Thomas Brennan's father died on a Monday in March, and by Thursday morning Thomas was standing alone in the barn, looking at the 1949 Farmall H his father had refused to sell for 40 years. The tractor sat in the back corner under a tarp that hadn't been moved in months, maybe years. Dust covered everything. The air smelled like old oil and mouse nests. Thomas pulled the tarp back slowly, and that's when he saw it, a single line carved into the painted metal just above the fuel tank, so worn by time and grime that he almost missed it. He leaned closer. The letters were shallow, deliberate, carved with something sharp, his father's handwriting, unmistakable even in metal. Thomas read it once, didn't understand it, and stood there wondering, what kind of man leaves a message where nobody's supposed to look? The funeral had been 2 days earlier. Small, quiet. His father, Jacob Brennan, had been 73 years old and had lived alone on 160 acres of Montana dryland wheat for the last decade, ever since Thomas's mother passed. Heart failure, the doctor said. Quick. Jacob had been found in his kitchen by a neighbor who'd stopped by to borrow a wrench. The coffee was still warm. People at the funeral said Jacob had been a good neighbor, a hard worker, a man who kept to himself. They didn't say he'd been warm. They didn't say he'd been easy to know. Jacob hadn't been those things. He'd been silent, methodical, and impossible to read. Thomas had spent 38 years trying to understand him and had mostly failed. What people did mention, what they always mentioned, was the Farmall. Jacob's stubbornness about that tractor had been a town legend for decades. Dealers had offered him trades. Neighbors had offered cash. During the worst years of the 80s, when half the county was liquidating, a collector from Billings had driven out specifically to buy it and offered Jacob $12,000. Jacob had said no every time. He'd never explained why. He'd just say the Farmall stayed, and that was the end of the conversation. Thomas had asked him about it once, maybe 15 years ago. Jacob had been working on the tractor in the barn, changing the oil. Thomas had said, "Why don't you just sell it? You don't even use it anymore." Jacob had looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Because I don't." That was the whole answer. Thomas had learned not to ask again. Now Jacob was gone, and Thomas was standing in the barn staring at a line carved into metal, and he still didn't understand. The farm was in trouble. Thomas had known that before Jacob died, but he hadn't known how bad. The lawyer handling the estate had called 3 days after the funeral and laid it out. Jacob owed $43,000 to the bank. Operating loans taken out over the last 5 years to cover bad harvests and rising costs. The land was worth maybe $160,000 if Thomas could find a buyer, which wasn't guaranteed. The equipment was old. The house needed repairs. And there was a payment due in 60 days that Jacob had been deferring for 8 months. Thomas lived in Spokane. He was a construction supervisor. He had a mortgage, a truck payment, and 2 kids in high school. He didn't farm. He'd left Montana 20 years ago and hadn't looked back. The plan had always been to let Jacob work the land until he couldn't anymore, then sell it and split the proceeds with his sister in Oregon. That had been the understanding. But Jacob had died too soon, and now Thomas was standing in a barn in a town he'd left behind, holding a problem he didn't know how to solve. The bank wanted a meeting. The equipment dealer wanted a decision. His sister wanted to know if they should list the property. Everyone had advice. Everyone had an opinion. And Thomas kept thinking about that line carved into the Farmall. He'd noticed it his first morning back, the day after the funeral. He'd walked into the barn just to look around, to take inventory, to figure out what needed to be sold. The Farmall had been sitting there like it always sat there, old, heavy, obsolete. Thomas had pulled the tarp off out of curiosity, maybe nostalgia. That's when he saw the carving. It was positioned just above the fuel tank on the left side, hidden unless you were standing close. The letters were crude, but readable. Thomas had stared at it for a long time, trying to remember when his father might have done it. Then he remembered. Summer of 1986. Thomas had been 16. His father had been working on the Farmall one afternoon, alone in the barn. Thomas had walked in to ask something, he couldn't remember what, and had seen his father bent over the tractor with a screwdriver, carving something into the metal. Thomas had asked what he was doing. Jacob had straightened up, put the screwdriver in his pocket, and said, "Maintenance." Then he'd walked out. Thomas had forgotten about it until now. That had been 36 years ago. The tractor hadn't been used since maybe 1990. Jacob had bought a newer John Deere in '89 and retired the Farmall to the barn. But he'd kept it, maintained it, refused every offer. Thomas read the line again. He still didn't understand it. The meeting with the bank was scheduled for Friday. Thomas drove into town and sat across from a loan officer named Sharon Vickers, who'd worked there for 20 years. She had Jacob's file open on the desk. She was professional, sympathetic, and direct. "Your father was a good customer for a long time," Sharon said, "but the last few years were difficult. Drought, low prices. He kept borrowing to cover operating costs, hoping the next year would be better. It wasn't." Thomas looked at the numbers. 43,000 in outstanding debt, payments 9 months overdue, interest accumulating monthly. Sharon leaned forward. "Here's what I can tell you. If you want to keep the farm, you'll need to bring the account current within 90 days. That's $43,000 plus penalties, roughly $46,000 total. If you can't do that, we'll need to discuss liquidation." Thomas asked the question he already knew the answer to. "What if I sell equipment?" Sharon pulled out another sheet. "We've had the equipment appraised. The John Deere tractor might bring $18,000 at auction. The grain truck, maybe $7,000. The cultivator, planter, various implements, another $8,000 combined. You'd net maybe $30,000 after auction fees. That leaves $16,000 outstanding, which we'd restructure as a lien against the land." Thomas sat there doing math. 30,000 from equipment. Maybe he could pull 10 from savings. That still left 6,000 short, plus he'd have no way to actually farm the land without equipment. He'd be paying a note on land he couldn't work. Sharon watched him calculate. Then she said, "There's another option. Sell the land, pay off the debt, walk away with whatever's left. Given the market, you'd probably clear 100,000 after everything settles. You could split that with your sister and move on." Thomas drove back to the farm and sat in his truck in the driveway for 20 minutes. Selling made sense. He didn't live here. He didn't farm. His sister didn't want it. The land would sell. The debt would clear. Everyone could move forward. He walked into the barn and looked at the Farmall again. The line was still there. He read it for the 10th time. That evening, Thomas called his sister. He told her what the bank said. She listened, then said, "So we sell, right? That's the smart move." Thomas didn't answer right away. His sister said, "Tom, you don't farm. I don't farm. Dad's gone. Keeping that place doesn't make sense." Thomas said, "I know." "So why do you sound like you're not sure?" Thomas looked out the kitchen window toward the barn. "Did Dad ever talk to you about the Farmall? The old tractor?" "Yeah." "Not really, just that he wouldn't sell it. Why?" Thomas didn't answer. His sister said, "Tom, that tractor's worthless. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment." They hung up. Thomas sat at the kitchen table where his father had eaten breakfast every morning for 40 years. The house was quiet, too quiet. The next morning, Thomas called the equipment dealer. A man named Rick Paulson answered. Thomas asked what the Farmall was worth. Rick laughed, not unkindly. The 49H? Maybe $3,000 to the right collector. Maybe less. It's not running, is it? I don't know. Well, if it runs and looks decent, maybe $3,500. But that's optimistic. Most people want newer iron. Thomas said, "What if I don't sell it?" Rick paused. "Then you've got a museum piece taking up barn space." Thomas thanked him and hung up. $3,000 wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't save the farm. It wouldn't pay the debt. But his father had turned down $12,000 in the 80s. He'd turned down every offer. There had to be a reason. Thomas walked back to the barn. He stood in front of the Farmall and read the line again. This time he read it out loud, slowly, letting each word settle. "Don't sell what bought you time." Thomas stood there for a long time. Then he walked back to the house and started going through his father's papers. He found notebooks, dozens of them, dating back to 1965, planting dates, yield records, expenses, rainfall measurements, his father's handwriting, meticulous and small. Thomas had seen these before, but had never read them carefully. Now he did. He found the entries from 1983. Terrible drought, crop failure, debt mounting. Then he found an entry from August 1983 that stopped him cold. Sold the Farmall M to Frank Dietrich for $8,200. Paid down operating loan. Avoided foreclosure. Lost the best tractor I ever owned. Thomas flipped forward. September 1983. Bought the 49H from auction in Great Falls for $2,100. Not as good as the M, but it's paid for. Thomas kept reading. His father had farmed with that Farmall H for 6 years, from 1983 to 1989. Slow, hard, long hours, but no payments, no debt on equipment, just fuel and maintenance. The notebooks showed it clearly. Expenses dropped, debt stabilized, the farm survived. In 1989, Jacob had finally bought the John Deere, financed it carefully, kept the payments manageable, but he'd never sold the Farmall. He'd kept it in the barn, maintained it, refused every offer, because it had bought him time when time was all he had. Thomas sat on the barn floor and read the line on the Farmall again. His father hadn't carved it as advice. He'd carved it as a reminder to himself, a promise, a warning. The Farmall had saved Jacob once. He'd sworn never to give it up again. Thomas called Sharon Vickers the next morning. He said he needed more time. Sharon said she could give him 30 days, maybe 60 if he showed good faith. Thomas said he'd show good faith. He listed the John Deere for sale. It sold in a week for $19,000. He listed the grain truck. It sold for $60 to $800. He sold the cultivator, the planter, miscellaneous implements. Total, $31,400. He pulled $12,000 from his savings. He borrowed $3,000 from his sister. Total, $46,400. He paid the bank in full on day 58. Sharon looked at the check and then looked at him. "What are you going to farm with?" Thomas said, "I'll figure it out." He drove back to the farm and walked into the barn. The Farmall was still there. Thomas spent 3 days working on it. He changed the oil. He drained the old fuel and refilled the tank. He replaced the spark plugs. He charged the battery. On the 4th day, he climbed into the seat and turned the key. The engine turned over twice and caught. It ran rough for 30 seconds, then smoothed out. The sound was high-pitched, steady, relentless. Thomas sat there listening to it. Then he shut it down. He called his boss in Spokane and quit his job. He called his wife and told her they were moving. She didn't understand at first. Then he explained, and she said, "Okay, we'll figure it out." Thomas moved his family to Montana in May. He rented equipment he didn't own. He planted 160 acres with the Farmall, pulling a borrowed planter. It took 3 weeks. His back hurt, his hands blistered. He came in every night exhausted. His kids asked why they couldn't just sell the farm and move back to Spokane. Thomas didn't have a good answer. He just said, "Because we don't." Harvest came in October. The yields were average. The prices were low. Thomas netted $14,000 after expenses. It wasn't much, but it was positive. That winter, Thomas changed the oil in the Farmall himself. He greased the fittings. He replaced the air filter. The tractor didn't ask for much, just fuel and maintenance. He stood in the barn one evening and read the line carved into the metal. He understood it now. His father hadn't been sentimental. He'd been practical. The Farmall had bought him time when he had nothing else. It had kept the farm alive when everything else wanted to kill it. Thomas had sold everything modern and expensive. He'd paid the debt. He'd kept the one thing that didn't owe anyone anything. He didn't know if he'd survive the next 5 years. He didn't know if prices would recover or collapse. He didn't know if his kids would forgive him for uprooting them. What he knew was this: the Farmall would start when he needed it to start. It would run as long as he kept fuel in it and oil in the crankcase, and it would never send him a bill. His father had understood that. He'd understood it so well he'd carved it into metal where only someone looking closely would find it. Thomas ran his hand over the carved letters. They were worn now, almost smooth, but the meaning wasn't. Don't sell what bought you time. His father had never explained himself in life. He didn't need to. The Farmall explained everything. Thomas walked out of the barn and looked at the fields. Spring would come. Planting would start. The Farmall would run. The farm would survive. Not because it was easy, because it was paid for. If this story made you think about your own family, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.